Thank you for choosing this part of the discussion. Our focus will be on Southeast Asia and energy transition. This is the region where we see a lot of very vibrant emerging economies who drive a very big share of the growth in the global energy markets. This is also the region that is very heavily dependent on coal, so energy transition is really a very big task. The good news is that we're already seeing a lot of very exciting development in clean energy, and we're here to talk about how we can ensure that the growth actually gets the funding needed. The Irie estimated that we're looking at $190 billion a year in 2030 to support that growth. So let's hear about what kind of innovative financial solutions are already there to support that. We're seeing a lot of real efforts on some of the climate solutions, such as the JETP that's achieved in some of the countries in the region. But let's see whether there's some more ideas. Of course, this is also the region that is very heavily impacted by the geopolitics, the impact of global energy markets, and also the growing collaboration within the region. So we have a great panel with me today to discuss all of these topics. So let me introduce the panelists one by one and pose the first round of questions to them. So how we would do a few questions with the panel and then open up for the discussion. Really good that we actually have a small, intimate audience, so feel free to sit in the front and we can have an even more intimate conversation here. Let me introduce the first panelist, Mr. Dannif from Pertamina, which is an Indonesian state-owned enterprise, and Mr. Dannif focus on clean renewable energy and new energy of the company, and you also bring a very extensive experience with across both energy projects and the finance. My first question to you is, as a leading energy company, how do you see the challenges and the opportunities for Indonesia's transition from coal to clean energy?
Thank you, Ailun. Thanks to be here. Thanks for the invite from Atlantic Council. Yes, Indonesia, as you all are already aware, we have a huge opportunity. We are a big country, big populations. We are in developing countries. We are growing 5% a year. That needs energy, right, to support the growth. For us, the energy policy is basically we need to have, as any other countries with the latest geopolitical situations, we need to have energy securities to make sure basically we can secure the growth. Hence, even if we have a huge opportunity, we also faces challenges, right, to be simultaneously I guess supporting the growth and transitioning and for the reducing the carbon emissions. I guess I start with the challenges that we face very much on the infrastructures, right, on the power generations. As we all know, it needs a strong grid for Indonesia itself. First, we do not have the whole country grid connectivities. There are I guess different locations where potentials renewable energy for power generation, different islands, and where the demand is. We also have an excess capacities, right, which we need to address. But the most important, and I think this is where we need collaboration from international communities, is two things. First is the policies, right, policy and regulations. As any other emerging countries, we need to adopt new policies and regulations that support the transitions energy and adoptions of new renewable energies. And the last one is the classic one is basically on the financing and funding, right? Again, but the second one is less so, because I believe if you do have a bankable project and scale project, the money will follow.
Thank you, John. The second speaker, Mr. Jonathan Goh, who is the Director of External Relations of Energy Market Authority of Singapore. So Jonathan also previously served in different roles at the Prime Minister's office and also Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As a government regulator, how do you reconcile the challenges with energy security concerns and the need to achieve net zero targets?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me as well. I think as what Park Dannif has mentioned, energy security it's a very real issue, as especially now that you have very high energy prices, in this very volatile energy environment, and also for the transition into the net zero. So in Singapore, 40% of all the emissions are actually coming out of our power generation. And we have also declared late last year that we want to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, right? So for a country that has almost zero renewable energy, to do that, it's always a challenge. And in the transition to that too, obviously, security of supply, to have a stable supply is also something that we look at very keenly. So, but we do think that there is a lot of opportunity for that collaboration in the region, right? I mean, as mentioned, there's a lot of renewable energy potential in Southeast Asia, and how do we then aggregate some of this so that the region as a whole can benefit, where I think areas where you need more renewable energy, cleaner energy, and also there are also regions where there are abundance of that and excess of that could actually then have a lot of that collaboration ongoing. And I think that for energy regulator is also a very interesting perspective. As you imagine, most countries, well, especially in Southeast Asia and all that, we're very focused on building our own energy landscape, making sure that our demand and supply within the country matches up. And we're kind of independent in that sense. But going on, moving forward for clean energy transitions, we need a lot of international cooperation. So, we are then looking at giving up some of this independence, right, of that regulation as well in terms of, also in demand and supply, right? And it's going to make sure that we can do this properly. We have started last year in June to actually import green electrons from Laos, right? So from Laos, hydropower, then to Thailand, to Malaysia, to Singapore. And this is something very new. We have never import electricity, right? And then how do we then also ensure that this supply continues to be stable, how it adds to our overall security? I think these are some things that I think as regulators we have to embrace as we move forward. We also are also looking at even now more electrons imports from the region. So perhaps also from Indonesia, So these are some things that we definitely need to think about in terms of energy security and all that.
Thank you. Just for audience benefit, what's the percentage of power currently Singapore is importing from other countries?
So we are now importing up to 100 megawatts of hydropower from Laos using existing infrastructure. Our peak demand is about 8 gigawatt. So it's really very small.
Okay.
But we would imagine by 2035 we will be importing 4 gigawatt of power, of clean energy power from the region.
Got it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next panelist, Dr. Irie, is the president of Asia Pacific Energy Research Center. Irie-san previously worked at METI in the Japanese government, and it also is a professor at University of Tokyo. So my question to you, your institute produces a lot of very high quality research on this topic. Could you tell us, will renewable energies and the low carbon technologies be able to meet the growing energy demand in the region?
Thank you, kind introduction, and thank you very much for supplying good occasion to introduce our research results. But very unfortunately, the answer is no. And let me use the memo I'm very bad memorizing numbers, so I need some memo. In Japanese English, we call it a cunning paper. Isn't it correct? So we produce the APEC Energy Demand and Supply Outlook every 3 years as our flagship project. And last year, September, we published the latest and 8th edition. And according to this 8th edition, APEC Southeast Asia, which consists of 7 economies, including Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, excluding East Timor, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, but covers, in terms of population, 88% of total Southeast Asia, and 96% in the GDP terms. So let me focus on the APEC Southeast Asia. This Southeast Asia is highly developing area. The last 2 decades, the energy demand supply almost doubled. It is the highest next to China. And in the coming 3 decades, towards 2050, that's our, target year, this trend will continue. So APEC Southeast Asia energy demand and supply will continue to double if there is no additional measures. And if each government try to reinforce the effort decarbonization and energy efficiency, say in a demand term, 6% increase and 70% increase in supply, 60% increase in demand will be anticipated. And this sub-region is only one sub-region in the APEC region to foresee increase, even in additional policy cases. Other sub-regions, including China, we foresee the decline compared to the base year 2018, but in 2015. But only Southeast Asia, the demand will continue to rise. And as for the ratio of the, say, renewables, renewable share in power will reach 34% in business as usual case, a reference case, without any additional policy measures. And even with additional measures, we foresee 45%. That means the rest of 55% will come from fossil fuels. But it's a good increase from the 22% in 2018. So we foresee the expansion of renewable, but the renewable simply cannot cover all. So we discuss we need more gas to replace coal in order to low carbonize the Southeast Asia power systems. Coal to gas switching is necessary along with expansion of renewables. That's our conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll come back to the guest question later. Let me introduce my last panelist, Diep Nguyen von Houtte, who is the Senior Manager for Climate Innovation and Business Development at IFC. And Diep, you have many years of experience working at the World Bank and IFC. Could you tell us how the region access the quantity of finance needed to achieve both, to meet the energy demand, but also to achieve the amount of clean energy development?
Thank you. It's lovely being here. So first of all, I believe that there's plenty of financing available. But that financing is looking for bankable projects to invest in. And there are many barriers to overcome. And governments have a huge role in helping private sector investment overcome those barriers. What are those barriers? First, legal frameworks. Government's policy and legal frameworks need to allow for private sector financing, including foreign investment. And those laws and legal frameworks need to be clear and transparent. The second, as we all know, state-owned enterprises play a very prominent role in key sectors in Southeast Asia. At the IFC, we can only work with SOEs that operate on commercial principles, that have clear internationally accepted governance mechanisms. And so SOE reform and facilitating SOEs operating on commercial principles is also very important. Governments publishing net zero plans, as the government of Indonesia and Vietnam have done, is very important. You know, the good news. The good news is there's a lot of interest in investing in renewable energy in East Asia. For example, Vietnam at Glasgow announced a huge ramp up in renewable energy generation capacity. It was the IFC and World Bank who actually helped Vietnam develop the offshore wind roadmap. But now one of the key barriers is the Vietnamese government has to pass PDP-8. So and the other good news for Vietnam is that there's a huge pipeline of projects. Developers are there. There's significant interest. The financing is there. But PDP-8 is the bottleneck. So again, we're coming back to policies that governments can influence to unlock the potential financing that's out there. And finally, I think I'm very proud that the government of the US has passed the IRA, which builds in a lot of incentives for investing in clean, renewable energy. And if governments can pass similar incentives, that would also unlock potential new financing.
Thank you. You mentioned the role of the U.S. domestically around IRA. We all know that U.S. of course also played a very active role in help facilitating the Indonesian and Vietnam JETP last year, the Just Energy Transition Partnership. So I want to come back to Dannif to ask you that the Indonesian JETP promised to mobilize $20 billion over the next 3 to 5 years. Of course, that's a lot of details are yet to be decided. But what did this deal mean for you and your business, and what kind of opportunities?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, right? As Secretary Kerry also mentions. Yeah, this is a big, I guess, program, right? So it was announced in G20 last November. I think now the devil's in details, like any other programs, right? Yes, 20 billion has been allocated or has been, confirmed. I think at the end, come back to what I said earlier, I just mentioned, we need to have the right policies and regulations, incentive, right, to make sure it can be deployed accordingly. I think those are one of the challenges, right? But I can assure you that I'm here as Pertamina. Pertamina is the state-owned enterprise. We're working together with government, right, through ESDM, MEMR, with MOF, with other government agencies and also ministries to make sure that we are doing it on the, what do you call it, on the small, not small step. Basically, we're not trying to address everything, right? We try to address, certain sectors because there's in the energy transitions, not only dealing with power generations. Power generation is one of the largest segments for emissions, but we're also dealing with the transportations, mobilities. We're dealing with the hard-to-abate industries, right? Those are sectors that maybe less regulated. Mm-hmm. Those are the sectors that maybe can be tackled earlier, right? Because how to increase adoptions of EV, right? Especially in two-wheelers. We are the third largest market for the two-wheelers segment. We have 120 million, right, motorcycles, and every year increase by 5 to 6 million of motorcycles. Those are using subsidized fuel and emit carbon, right? This type of programs needs a lot of funding, right? Incentive, tax, I guess, maybe interest subsidies to increase the EV two-wheelers adoptions or four-wheelers and then any other thing. Those are the things or programs that we think can be implemented immediately. While, the big one, we already announced that no more coal, right? No more coal development of power generations and how to accelerate the retirement of coal power plant. Those are still in the works, right? We have this ETM, Energy Transitions Mechanisms, of which, along with, international agency to fund, the retirement of the coal. Those are few project and program how to, utilize the JETP program.
I want to come back to you to ask about the phase-out mechanism, which is also something that's important to remember. It's not just about having the right innovative mechanism to encourage the new and clean ones, but also how we can quickly accelerate the early retirement of the existing ones. But I want to also go back to Jonas. So you mentioned a few times the importance of regional collaboration. You also serve as the member of the ASEAN Governing Council for the ASEAN Center for Energy. What role do you think ASEAN is going to play in driving the energy security and the climate collaboration in this region?
I mean, if you look at ASEAN as a whole, it's a 700 million population, right? I mean, it's not a small population by any means. And if you look at the power demand, right, that it actually will grow over the next 20, 30 years, it's actually equivalent to the entire European Union today. So how do we need to manage this growth, as I think Prof. Irie, you mentioned, right? I mean, the growth will be there. There's a lot of renewable energy investments already taking place, but it's not catching up with the growth in the demand, right? So I think a lot of things that we need to work together, and I think ASEAN over the years, has band together and look at some of the targets they want to do, right? So, for instance, energy efficiency intensity, right? How are we going to lower the energy intensity over the years? How are we going to increase renewable energy, mixed within the region by 2025 to about 23% in the region? So there are all these aspirational targets, I think, which are important. And then linking back to really the point about making sure the policies are clear and all that. I think I have to say that we're very proud that since 2006 we are publishing the ASEAN Energy Outlook, and we've just done the 7th edition, I think, at last year's the ASEAN Energy Ministers meeting. And I think this gives at least a lot of some clarity to a lot of investors in the region on what are the scenarios that will happen in the region, what kind of policy recommendations that we need to really look at for the ASEAN to transit. And then just coming back to your point about EV, which I think is important because it's increasingly now an important discussions within the ASEAN family, because transport takes up a significant part of energy, right? I mean, look at all the different. And how can we have minimal standards, harmonized standards across the ASEAN family to also encourage the adoption of EVs? I think these are some of the things that we need to think about going forward. But the other point which I thought was also very important that you also mentioned is some things we can do already today, which is quite easy. Cooling itself, it's going to be quite massive, right? If you imagine some of the populations today in Southeast Asia, I mentioned about 700 million people. I would imagine 80% of these 700 million people do not have access to air conditions. So as the economy modernizes and people have better standards of living, there'll be a lot of demands for cooling. And just imagine the enormous kind of pressure that it will take on for the power generation company and also for emissions. And now we already have minimal standards across and harmonized standards across ASEAN to be able to help us look at the standards for air conditions, for manufacturers to be able to buy and sell within the region. And I think these are things that are very practical that we should start doing and should really implement on the ground. And I think that will elevate a lot of that pressure going forward.
Thank you. It's interesting that a few panelists mentioned that let's maybe start with, I wouldn't say easy, but maybe a bit more practical is to start with electric mobility and also some of the cooling type of projects, energy efficiency projects. But I do want to still come back later to see how can we address some of the more difficult, challenging power sector transformation. But my next question to you again, Irie-san, you mentioned about the role of gas. Well, first of all, how do you think this region can actually access the gas that you mentioned? But then if the region actually successfully get those gas, are you worried about the gas might take up the resources that might be needed for the clean energy part? I think that looking at the US example, it was a quite ideal thought that gas will play the bridging role, but somehow they also extended their welcome, and now they're quite difficult to get them out of the bridging role as well. And would you worry about that kind of lock-in situation in the region?
Yeah. For Southeast Asia, even within the region, there's some gas fields. The Malaysia, the previously in Thailand, and some the Philippines, and close to Southeast Asia, there's a rich gas deposit of the Australia continent. And also it's not so far from the Middle East, including UAE, and also it's available from the United States. So using the ship trading, the gas is available, but the price is a problem because unlike Europe, Asia has to use gas as a LNG mostly, and the LNG is much expensive than pipeline gas. And as for the, allocation of the fund, it's a very good question, and in order to answer your question correctly, precisely, and quantitatively, we should know the future estimate of the marginal cost of reducing CO2 emission, but it's very difficult. So, but in general, renewables are natural energy, and availability of renewables is largely influenced by the natural conditions. And it's not so well known outside Asia, but Southeast Asia, the endowment of natural renewable energy is not so good compared to, say, the Europe. So I understand the marginal cost of further introduction of renewable might be high. Mm-hmm. So if we reduce investment in natural gas, increasing renewable investment, we may face some shortage of power supply. I'm afraid that ended up continuation of a further increase of coal power generation and increase of CO2 emission as a result.
Thank you. Seems like quite a big challenge to get the balance right. So next question to Diep. You mentioned about the important role of getting policy right in order to drive innovative financial models. However, for some of the market, maybe policies are a little bit more ready. What innovative models that you are seeing that you feel like should be shared more widely as good cases?
Thank you. I'll talk about several instruments and models. One of the models that we're working with governments of Southeast Asia on, and I've seen in various regions of the world, is asset recycling. And this is where governments would either sell, lease, or concession existing assets to the private sector to manage. And this has multiple benefits. First, it brings in new financing for governments to invest in new assets, new technology, new renewable energy assets, and it frees the government of the management of that existing asset, which can be handed over to more efficient private sector entities who can manage and develop these assets and add value to these assets. The private sector entities can basically come up with new ideas for adding value, including bringing in new technologies and preventing these assets from becoming stranded assets. This model, it has a crucial role in resilience to climate change. So I've seen proposals for private sector companies to develop coastal areas, protect coastlines, and use the land and the assets in these coastal areas to develop into eco-parks, industrial parks, ecotourism zones. This asset recycling model has just, again, multiple benefits. It brings government new revenue, new sources of financing to invest in new projects, at the same time leveraging private sector innovation, efficiencies, and financing to develop potentially stranded assets or old assets and add more value to them. Second instrument is sustainability-linked financing. We have this financing at the IFC, and basically what it is it's a financing mechanism that gives incentives for companies, corporations, to develop a climate action plan, a net zero plan with targets for climate resilience. And if they meet these objectives, then we lend at a certain interest rate. If they exceed these targets, then what we do is we give them a step down in the interest rate. So, and if they don't, then it's a step up. So it's a lending mechanism that builds in incentives for good performance against a company's climate action plan. And of course, we've ramped up significantly our green loans, blue loans, and bonds.
Thank you. Very interesting cases. I want to mention this model of asset recycling. Actually, in many of the Eastern European countries, we see that model actually being applied quite unhelpfully with some of the coal-fired plants, where you see certain current coal-fired plant owners sell it to other companies to get them off the book, but then they end up being not properly managed and might end up actually causing more environmental damages, you know. And I want to just actually come back to you, Dannif, about, you also mentioned about the mechanism of ETM and, you know, that Indonesia is starting to look into how to early retire some of the coal-fired plants. What, in your model, in your opinion, is a good model for some of for potential early retirement of coal assets?
That's good questions. We're still looking, I think. No, we have. I think obviously Pertamina is not in the power generation business. I mean, we do have PLN, right? I think there are a couple of projects, right, in the works that to retire old inefficient coal power plants in Indonesia, right? Mostly in Java. But again, back to the condition in Indonesia, yes, we do have excess supply in Java and in Sumatra, but overall as a country, we know 100% you know, have an energies, right, access. So energy security, reliability, and most important for Indonesia is affordability. Now again, what will be the I guess the right or the best program to retire coal-fired power plant in Indonesia? To be honest, I do not have the answer for that. We are still looking. As far as my understanding, there are a couple of projects in the works, right? Has been announced. The thing is, for sure, right? We are SOE. We're very close with the government, right? Affordability is very important, and then security and reliability is right. And Indonesia need to invest in its distributions, right? Transmission distribution network, because even if we do have, you know, or we can develop, you know, solar or any other renewable, they are all intermittent, right? There's big intermittencies, right? We cannot replace coal-fired power plant because we need a base load, right? What we can do right now, unfortunately, with non-connectivity of the transmissions is we still heavily rely. I think gas to power is the energy transitions, right? The other thing that the country has, and this is Pertamina has a big role via NOC, right, oil and gas company, is actually to introduce products that less carbon emissions, less on biofuels, right? We have a program for gasifications to replace imported and subsidized LPGs, right, with DME. And we do have a lot of goal for that. Yes, there's still some emission for that, but at least for the countries, and Indonesia is developing countries, we need, we don't have a lot of money spare to do the energy, we do have other competing, right? We have healthcare, we have security as others, right? So again, this is where at the end, collaborations with international agencies, right? The JETP program is crucial, right? Implementation and deployment for that. Sorry, a bit all over the place, but...
No, it's very, very helpful to actually understand all the competing priorities and the reality on the ground. I want to pause and see whether audience have any questions. And there's can you bring the mic here? And if you don't mind, also identify yourself. That would be helpful.
Good morning. Lura Caboni with the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. The question is the region, whether Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, considering nuclear or small modular reactors? And perhaps the second part is nuclear considered renewable from a financing perspective as well?
Thank you. Would you be able to answer this question?
Yeah, you mean the nuclear?
Yeah.
Yeah, we expect some nuclear introduction in Vietnam in business as usual case. And even carbon neutral case, we foresee further embarking economy in Southeast Asia. In the EPIC, we foresee expansion of nuclear, but mainly that's in China and Russia, not in Southeast Asia, unfortunately. But I understand there's some growing interest in Southeast Asia. I attended October? He organized the Singapore International Energy Week. I attended the last session on nuclear in Asia. And there's a participant from Philippines. And as you know, the Philippines tried to embark nuclear power plant as early as Korea. But the various reasons, especially political reasons, the Philippines abandoned. But now the Philippine experts try to revitalize the movement for nuclear, and the new president are interested in the revitalizing a nuclear plants. So I hope some new wave in nuclear in South Asia, and I can, include such a movement in our next outlook in 2025.
Thank you. Jonathan, is there some ASEAN perspective on this?
I think, we've covered quite a little bit on the nuclear front. Yes, there's some interest from Philippines. There was a little bit more from Vietnam a couple of years ago. And I think across Southeast Asia, there's always keen interest to know the safety standards of nuclear power plants, especially post-Fukushima, right? So I think over in Singapore too, for us, because we do not have any energy resources to start with, so everything is on the table. All choices, all options are open. So we are open to nuclear power if the safety standards are able to meet the circumstances of our country, right? If you imagine we are a very small little dot, right? And if there is safety standards are not there, then there's probably nowhere else we can go. So we've done some pre-feasibility studies, and I think our findings are that today's standards of the existing power plants fleet, probably not very suitable for Singapore. But if SMRs, were to be able to be actually commercially viable, safe enough, I think we're open for that discussions. And so on our end, we continue to make sure that we know the knowledge of what's going on in the nuclear power world, train enough nuclear scientists in Singapore to be able to understand all these different developments as well. I think so. That's something that I think some of the Southeast Asian countries are also looking at. Yeah.
Thanks. There's another question. First row.
I just wanted to ask about the LNG reserves in West Papua and their capacity to be able to both service Indonesia and other Southeast Asian nations.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay. I think I'm referring to Tangguh here. That's a BP. I believe there are a large, reserve, and I think they're expanding to Train 3. I don't know the details, but I think it's been allocated, right? Obviously, mostly for, again, energy securities. For Indonesia, we basically make sure that for power generation and to support industries that needs, energy, right? This is the list of strategic national industries. I think the rest is either for export because there's a Japanese partner there, or for other allocation for captive power plant supporting the smelters, right? Which is usually the location is quite remote. There's no transmissions available.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Munif was talking about coal retirement in Indonesia, and in one of the previous sessions in this morning, we heard about Indonesia teaming up with some international partners to phase out some of the projects, coal-based power generation projects. Do you have any time frame for that, one more question. I think Abu Dhabi Future Investment Company, Masdar, is involved with one of the projects in Indonesia. Can you talk about its current status?
Okay. I think there's the retirement of coal power plant in Indonesia is a program run by ESDM, the MEMR, right, Ministry of Energy and Mineral and Resources, along with PLN as the electricity utilities companies, which they have the most of the coal-fired power plant. I think, as I said, there are a couple of examples or projects, right? No example project that's in the works. I do not think there is a best, structures, because at the end, the one who financed this, right, it needs to be compensated with new renewable energy projects, right? And as I mentioned earlier, in Indonesia, we do have excess of capacities, have an affordabilities as one of the key pillars for energy security, energy policies, right? Reliability, affordability, and securities, right? And everything is through just transitions in Indonesia. So I think it's still in the works. I think there are two has been announced, right? One private, one is PLN for early retirement. For the second question on Masdar, right? My understanding, again, I'm not from PLN. I think they have a project to develop floating for solar, right, in Cirata. Understanding is actually in development.
I encourage more questions, but while the audience try to think about, digest what have already been discussed, I want to ask one more question. I think a few panelists mentioned the importance of grid, and of course, even within a lot of the Southeast Asia countries, grid connection is a challenge. But if we want to encourage more interregional regional collaboration and be able to, for example, for Singapore to benefit from other countries' clean energy development, then we're probably thinking about even more interconnectivities across the region and ideas about, super grid and all that. I'm very curious. I don't know whether Jonathan or Iris don't have some idea on how you see as the prospect of a stronger grid construction in this region.
Yeah. In the previous panel discussion, the gentleman from GE pointed out the importance of grid system for further introduction of renewables. It's true. And in Europe, the grid system is the past. In Europe, the national grid system well established, interconnection well established. The problem in Asia, Southeast Asia, is even national grid system is still under development. Because unlike Europe, it's not continent. Many island countries, Indonesia, Philippines, even Malaysia, Malaysia, Peninsula Malaysia, and the Sabah Sarawak is not connected. And if you have a very wide grid system, somewhere, no wind, no sunshine, but somewhere, sunshine and wind. So the intermittency of photovoltaic and wind power can be neutralized or offset with this sheer size of the grid system. And also, in the case of Malaysia, Sabah Sarawak, there's some considerable potential of hydro, but they cannot export to the peninsula, Kuala Lumpur or Johor or somewhere. So grid system is very important, but expensive, especially compared to overland grid system. Undersea connection is very expensive. That's a difficult question for us.
Definitely the question of grid infrastructure is very important. At the IFC and World Bank Group, we've been encouraging governments to change policies to allow private sector investment in transmission and distribution infrastructure. And we also have significant programs to encourage a regional energy trade, including in developing cross-border transmission lines. We've done this in continental East Asia between Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, for example, to allow energy trade. We've done this in South Asia. I myself was part of the team preparing the transmission line between India and Nepal, and there's energy trade going on between those two countries, and extension to Bangladesh is next. And World Bank Group has also facilitated and finance transmission lines in the Africa continent, as well as between Central Asia and South Asia.
Don't know whether other panelists have any thoughts on this.
I mean, well, just to add that there is an ASEAN power grid that there's been a discussion for the last 30 years, and so what has happened is that there's a lot of interconnections between two countries, right? But beyond two countries is something that is always challenging, and hence I think over the last few years, having this Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore project was the first one that has power trading between 4 countries, right? So this is something that we continue to push for, and obviously harmonizing the standards, across, it's always a challenge which we kind of dealt with in this project. It continues to be a challenge, and there's a lot of development that needs to be done, I think, in the grid infrastructure. And just to add to that, not just over land, but subsea cables is very new to the whole region, right? I don't think there are significant subsea cables linking different parts of the country or different countries together. And if you were to stay very connected, as a whole, then that I think is the next, adventure that all of us need to embark on. IFC also need to come into play too, because these infrastructures, subsea cables across 1,002 kilometers of, it requires significant investment, capital investment, and over long periods of time. And the recovery and the risk that is also undertaken by all these entities are very real. But if we could ensure that these infrastructure are in place, then I think a lot can be done in terms of the energy transition in the region. It's very substantial. You look at archipelago Indonesia, Philippines, thousands of islands, and how are we going to make sure that everybody stays connected? I think that's something that ASEAN as a whole must continue to discuss.
Thanks. I want to switch back to another technology, solar, which given the declining cost of solar, it's becoming increasingly attractive in many places. However, just before the session starts, I was also talking with Dannif, where you were mentioning about how solar is, of course, developing faster, but not so promising in the case of Indonesia. And you mentioned about policy, the importance of policy environment. What would you say is the main reason or barrier, and what policy you think, if fixed, would really help unlock the potential of solar in Indonesia, which is a country that benefits from enormous solar resources, and so clearly it's more some of the policy challenges that's stopping the country from benefiting more from this free and abundant resources.
Yeah, I think, as I said, policy and regulations, but also because of the archipelagos of Indonesia, right? It creates challenge where solar needs, a lot of space, a lot of land. Yeah, it may work in this part of the world, right, and have a lot of high, irradiations, or in North Australia, with a lot of free land available. Indonesia, as I said, back to the infrastructures where there's no grid connectivities, right? Yes, we do have a lot of land in the eastern of Indonesia, the east of Bali. Those are the highest irradiations, right? But the demand is not there. The demand is actually on the west, which is on Java and Sumatra, right? And not so much a lot of availability land, right? In Java, right? Because that's the Java and Sumatra basically were the 60% of the demand. Yeah. So I think those are most of the challenges in terms of regulations. Again, yeah, it could be improved, right? It's single buyer, right? But at the end, PLN needs to make sure that the reliability is number one, right? Because we don't want to have any spike, and back to the state of the grid, right? Which is old, which is not reliable, cannot absorb any spikes, right? If there is cloud, it's a drop, right? And then the power plant cannot, follow to make sure. I mean, all these things very technical, right? Very technical, but that is the reasons why it does not grow as much as a developed country.
Well, Diep, IFC used to run a quite successful program scaling solar. If you look at Southeast Asia, this region, what experience you can share?
Well, we still run scaling solar. It's been a very successful program, and it's scaling up around the world, especially in Africa. Look, I think East Asia has been very successful in bringing solar energy, and it's bankable enough for private sector investment. I mean, commercial bankers and developers are very active in solar energy in East Asia, especially in Vietnam, for example. The generation capacity for renewable energy, especially solar and wind in Vietnam, has scaled up dramatically just over the last few years. So I think Indonesia may have particular conditions, but it's a very active market in other countries in East Asia, including Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Philippines.
Let's see whether there's other audience members who might want to pose more questions.
Let me add one comment on photovoltaic. I'm looking for not only Southeast Asia, but other Asia-Pacific region. And in Asia-Pacific region as a whole, most promising for solar power is Australia and Chile. Flat and dry. South Asia, fortunately, but unfortunately for solar power, is wet.
Yes. A lot of cloud.
Rainfall and cloud. It's good for agriculture, but not so good for power generation.
That's
For
very
rice
interesting.
cultivation.
Rice, yeah.
Interesting you mentioned Australia, who of course right now is really going through a very fast growth of solar, and also is talking about the ambition of building a long cable even to Singapore to export the clean energy. Not sure whether the panelists think about that potential, and maybe especially Jonathan. I think that cable is supposed to end at Singapore, right? Is that happening?
Well, so the we have been approached by the company called Sun Cable, who is thinking of perhaps exporting solar power from the northern territories in Australia to maybe to Indonesia and then to Singapore, right? But you may have also heard that the company is going through some restructuring at the moment. Yeah, so perhaps not very appropriate for me to comment further at this point. Yeah.
Is that you?
Yeah. Now that we are discussing with the Australian counterpart that Australia may have opportunity to export hydrogen by electrolyzing water by photovoltaics. But the challenge is availability of water. Australia is too dry.
We also see that Australia actually start to use clean energy for mining very aggressively. And of course, mining is a very big sector throughout the Southeast Asia regions. And I'm just curious for the panelists, how do you see the potential of actually having clean energy projects for mining directly? Is that an easier, I wouldn't say easier, but relatively more promising short-term growth area? Yep.
Yes, let me talk about that. So at the International Finance Corporation, we have developed a sustainable mining platform where we look at different aspects of how to make mining operations more sustainable. And definitely developing mini grids, solar and wind farms to supply energy to the mining operations is definitely part of it. But there's also water reuse, recycling water, and transport infrastructure, making that cleaner. Also using electric vehicles, including for heavy equipment. And then finally ensuring that the local communities benefit from the mining operations and helping local communities create jobs or have jobs in mining operations and having a role in the development and operations of the mine.
See whether other panelists want to also chime in on this. How about Indonesia?
Yeah, so I think for Indonesia, maybe I just want to make sure the key takeaway, right? Not specifically for mining, but overall, in general, we are committed in the energy transitions. We have a pledge for net zero emissions no later by 2060, right? We have committed on the NDC's target. So I think we discussed a lot of challenges, right? What needs to be done, right? But as mentioned by the other panelists, Southeast Asia is 700 million populations, right? We are the highest growth regions, and half of it in Indonesia, right? I can assure you there are huge opportunity in this energy transition phase periods for the next 5, 10, 20 years, right? And we do, right now, yes, there are some challenges. Regulatory is not there, incentives is not there, it's not what I call it, correct, it's not, I guess, appropriate yet, but it will change, right? It will change and must change, because Indonesia cannot stay at the current state, right? We have huge target, we have made a pledge, and I think with that commitment, and I can see the future is very bright and huge opportunity for investment in the renewable energy sector.
Well, thank you for trying to wrap up your contribution on a very positive note. I don't know whether other panelists also want to share some last comments.
I definitely agree that there are plenty of opportunities out there, and at the same time, there are some challenges to resolve. And this is where governments need the support of international partners, including the international financial institutions like the IFC and the World Bank Group, to help solve both the policy issues, but also to bring in the private sector players. And blended finance is also key, and therefore involving the philanthropic players to help with capacity support and to provide the financing for buying down the capex costs, especially for some of the newer technologies that are not yet bankable. And de-risking instruments. We have all of it out there, and we're ready to support governments in achieving these targets.
Thank you very much. Actually, Diep also reminded that I forgot to introduce myself as the facilitator. I'm Ailun, I'm with Bloomberg Philanthropies. I do want to make sure that our panelists, all of the panelists, get a chance to say some last words. Irie-san, you want to share something?
Yeah, I'm serving for the Asia-Pacific region as a whole, but as for nationality, I'm a Japanese. So at last, let me talk about one Japanese. Apparently, the marginal cost of reducing carbon emission in Japan is higher than those in Southeast Asia. And Japanese economy is heavily dependent on Southeast Asia. Japanese company invested there, many factory there, market there. So the Japanese government is eager to cooperate with Southeast Asian governments to decarbonize this region. So together with Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, Vietnam, and other Southeast Asian governments, Japan will pursue decarbonization path in this region.
Thank you. Japan definitely plays a very important role in the region. Jonathan, last word.
Okay, just maybe 2 quick points. I think energy transition, right, we think it's a bottom-up endeavor. And all the young people today are very conscious of the world that they want to live in the future. So I think in Southeast Asia, very young population, a lot of people are demanding the governments do more, for their cleaner, future. So I'm very positive. And they're also aware that there are many employment opportunities in the green space, right? And statistics have shown, the ASEAN Central Energy have tabulated millions of jobs will be created. And I think they are attracting a new generation, of youth going to this. And I think as what we can do is to facilitate some of this. And so as Dannif said, I'm positive, and I think the future is bright for the region.
Thank you for ending this panel on such a positive note with a focus on the youth and the future. I would like to invite everybody to give our wonderful panelists a round of applause and for your wonderful discussion. Thank you.